That is the agency that has sent that company what is reported to be an expansive 9-page subpoena demanding that that insurance broker hand over more than 10 years of internal company documents that mention Donald Trump or the Trump Organization, plus all policies that were issued to the president or to his business, plus any applications or supporting materials that were submitted by the president or his business in order to obtain those insurance policies. And no, that is not opening up a mob honeypot scrapyard up by the Mets old stadium. But the ball on this one is now rolling with that same agency.
To your knowledge, did the president ever provide inflated assets to an insurance company?
Yes.
Can you explain why you had these financial statements and what you used them for?
When we were dealing later on with insurance companies, we would provide them with these copies so that they would understand that the premium, which is based sometimes upon the individual's capabilities to pay, would be reduced.
And all of this was done at the president's direction and with his knowledge?
Yes.
And did this information provided to us inflate the president's assets?
I believe these numbers are inflated.
To your knowledge, did the president ever provide inflated assets to a bank in order to help him obtain a loan?
But you may answer that question.
These documents and others were provided to Deutsche Bank on one occasion where I was with them in our attempt to obtain money so that we can put a bid on the Buffalo Bills.
Thank you for your answers.
Today, for the 4th time in 9 days, the president's longtime attorney, Michael Cohen, gave testimony to Congress. For the 2nd time today, he testified behind closed doors to the Intelligence Committee in the House. That committee had initially only intended to speak with him once, Thursday of last week, but Cohen's lawyers and members of that committee say a decision was made to bring him back for a 2nd round of testimony today, only because Cohen brought that committee substantial new information last week. Committee members decided they wanted to ask him more about that new information, and crucially, they wanted to ask him to provide any supporting documentation he could show them that might be able to back up these claims. And again, we don't know what has happened behind closed doors. But even just the stuff, the physical stuff that Cohen provided during his public testimony looks like it may be real trouble. I mean, those financial statements you just heard Cohen being questioned about, those financial statements were 3 years worth of statements of financial condition that Cohen says were submitted by the president and his business to at least one bank to try to obtain a bank loan, and 2 insurance companies. And what Cohen described about the content of those financial statements and what they were used for looks very much like a reasonably substantiated allegation of felony bank fraud and felony insurance fraud. I mean, Cohen stated that the assets on those financial statements appeared to him to be inflated. That is not a wild claim. One Trump property that's listed on those statements, property in Westchester County, was bought by Trump for under $8 million. Since 2012, it has twice been assessed as being worth less than $20 million. Forbes just yesterday reported that the net worth of that property right now is about $24 million. The president himself, in his federal ethics declaration last year, declared that he believed that property to be worth somewhere between $25 and $50 million. Nevertheless, despite those assessed values in the president's own declaration of the worth of that property this past year, on those financial statements, he listed the worth of that property as $291 million. And again, he reportedly used these statements with banks and insurance companies. And $291 million is not a rounding error for a property like this. In addition to that, the Washington Post further reports that upon reviewing these financial statements, it appears that Trump not only inflated the value of some of his assets, he also, quote, exaggerated his wealth by leaving things out. In 2011 and 2012, for instance, the statements of financial condition omitted his hotel in Chicago, which at the time was carrying a high debt load. The likely result, Trump's overall debt seemed smaller. And, you know, this isn't a moral story, right? I mean, it says something about your character, but that's beside the point, right? I mean, it's one thing to, you know, tell somebody you met at a bar that you're worth a lot more than you are. It's like, you know, it's like lying about your height. or lying about being first in your class at Wharton, or lying about how much money you inherited from your dad and whether or not you're self-made, lying about whether or not you won the popular vote, lying about your inaugural crowd, lying about whether or not you ever actually built 1 inch of the wall. I mean, lying is lying is lying. Lying can be a whole way of life, it turns out. But it's different when you lie in your written financial statements that you have submitted to financial institutions in an effort to try to get bank loans or to defraud insurance companies. When you lie in financial statements like that, those industries are tightly regulated, at least against that kind of fraud. And when you lie to those kinds of financial institutions for those kinds of purposes, and there's documentation of it, you're telling the kinds of lies that get chased down and prosecuted by, among others, the types of people who are willing to open up a fake scrapyard in Queens and then film themselves getting firebombed multiple times in order to lock up 50 mobsters at a go. And to the extent that Michael Cohen's testimony and supporting documentation bolsters claims of felony bank fraud, it's important to know that the entity Cohen described as the target of that attempted bank fraud, Deutsche Bank, they are now reportedly cooperating with congressional investigators. When it comes to the insurance side of that alleged fraud by Cohen, it's important to note that upon receiving that expansive subpoena from the agency that invented stadium scrap and faced off with Jumbo, that large insurance agency is also reportedly fully cooperating with law enforcement and investigating authorities. So those balls are rolling. And speaking of rolling, today Michael Cohen was back before the Intelligence Committee again. And this time, in what must have been an ominous sign for the White House, Michael Cohen and his legal team walked into that testimony rolling a bunch of suitcases. 1 suitcase, 2 suitcases, 3 suitcases, plus all the file folders and the briefcases, all full of documents. Among the materials that Michael Cohen is said to have handed over to the Intelligence Committee today were additional documents about the preparation of his previous testimony to Congress, for which he has now pled guilty to lying about certain aspects of the Trump Organization's secret efforts during the campaign to build a big, rich Moscow real estate project with help from the Russian government and at least 1 sanctioned Russian bank. Think about those lies. Why did Cohen lie that way to Congress the first time he testified before them? There's no reason that those lies about the Trump Tower Moscow project would have benefited Michael Cohen in any way himself. The lies that he told in that testimony, which again, he's pled guilty for, those lies appear to have been designed not to help himself at all, but instead to offer political cover to President Trump. According to reports from Emily Jane Fox at Vanity Fair and CNN and others, today's new documents from Cohen about that testimony were intended to bolster the claims from Cohen that lawyers acting on behalf of President Trump helped concoct his false testimony about Trump Tower Moscow. Again, false testimony that did not benefit Cohen. It specifically benefited President Trump. And soliciting false testimony before Congress is usually described as obstruction of justice. It was described that way in the articles of impeachment, both against Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. Just as a matter of criminal law, it's also just potentially suborning perjury, which is a felony in its own right. Although, of course, that would depend on the exact facts of the case. But today was the day when Michael Cohen initially was supposed to be reporting to federal prison to start serving his federal prison sentence for lying to Congress and campaign finance felonies and other crimes. After being given a few weeks extension by the federal judge overseeing his case, it is just remarkable to see him spending his last weeks of liberty rolling in suitcases full of documents that may ultimately stand to bury the president.